A black family saved their money in 1888 to take a portrait so their children would remember them. They never knew that one tiny detail in that photograph would one day reveal they were descended from African royalty. In the year 1888, inside a modest portrait studio, a photograph was taken that seemed ordinary in every possible way. A black family stood and sat together in formal clothing, arranged carefully in front of a painted backdrop. The father stood proudly behind his seated wife, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. 4 children surrounded them, dressed neatly in their finest garments, their expressions serious in the traditional style of portraits from that era. To anyone glancing at the image, it would have appeared to be nothing more than a simple family photograph from the late 19th century. For more than a century, that was exactly how it was treated. The photograph sat quietly inside an archive box, one of thousands of images documenting life in post-Civil War America. Historians occasionally handled it while cataloging records, but no one paid particular attention to it. It remained a silent artifact from a distant past, preserving the faces of people whose story had long been forgotten. The photograph had originally been taken in Richmond, Virginia, a city deeply shaped by the history of slavery, the Civil War, and the difficult years of Reconstruction that followed. In the late 1800s, portrait photography had become a meaningful milestone for many families. For newly freed black families especially, sitting for a professional portrait carried powerful symbolic meaning. It was a way of claiming dignity, identity, and permanence in a world that had once denied them even the basic recognition of their humanity. Portrait studios across the South began offering formal photographs that families could treasure and pass down through generations. These portraits were often carefully staged. The subjects wore their best clothes, maintained composed expressions, and sat still for the long exposure times required by the cameras of the period. The result was usually a solemn image, meant to convey respectability, stability, and pride. The family in the 1888 photograph appeared to embody exactly that spirit. The father's posture suggested strength and responsibility, while the mother sat calmly at the center of the composition, her presence anchoring the family around her. The 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, stood or sat nearby with quiet discipline, their faces serious but composed. Their clothing was simple yet carefully chosen. The daughters wore dresses appropriate for the time, while the boys wore small suits that mimicked the formal style of their father. Even the painted backdrop behind them, depicting a peaceful garden scene, was typical of portrait studios of that era. Nothing about the setting appeared unusual or dramatic. Because of this, the photograph spent decades unnoticed among countless other archival images. Institutions and libraries often stored thousands of historical photographs, many of which were never examined closely beyond basic cataloging. Archivists recorded the date, location, and any identifying marks on the back of the photograph before placing it into storage. Over time, these images became part of vast collections documenting everyday life in previous centuries. While historians valued them as visual records, only a small number were studied in depth. The 1888 family portrait remained one of those overlooked pieces of history. More than 100 years passed before anyone began to look at the photograph with fresh attention. In the early 21st century, advances in technology transformed the way historians could study old images. High-resolution scanners, digital imaging software, and artificial intelligence tools allowed researchers to examine details that would have been impossible to see with the naked eye. Tiny imperfections, textures, and patterns within photographs could now be magnified thousands of times without damaging the original image. These innovations opened new possibilities for historians studying clothing, architecture, facial features, and other elements preserved in historical photographs. At the Smithsonian Institution, a large project had begun to digitize and study thousands of images documenting African American history. The goal was not simply to preserve the photographs, but also to analyze them in ways that might reveal hidden information about the people they depicted. Many of these photographs were taken during the decades following the Civil War, a time when formerly enslaved individuals were building new lives and communities. Historians hoped that careful study might uncover forgotten stories about families whose names had vanished from historical records. During the cataloging process, researchers encountered the 1888 Richmond portrait. At first glance, it appeared similar to many other family photographs from the same period. The composition was standard, the clothing typical, and the background familiar. Yet something about the image stood out to one researcher studying it carefully. The woman seated at the center of the photograph, the matriarch of the family, had eyes that looked unusually clear compared to most portraits from the late 19th century. This detail might seem small, but it was highly unusual. Cameras during the 1880s required long exposure times and used photographic chemicals that limited the clarity of fine details. As a result, the eyes in many old photographs often appeared dark, blurred, or lacking distinct texture. Subtle features within the iris were almost never visible. However, in this photograph, the woman's eyes appeared strikingly defined even through the faded sepia tones of the print. They seemed almost luminous, as though they contained a level of detail that the technology of the time should not have been able to capture. Curiosity led researchers to examine the photograph more closely using modern imaging technology. The image was scanned at extremely high resolution, allowing every microscopic detail of the photograph to be enlarged and studied digitally. When the scan was magnified further, something remarkable became visible within the woman's irises. There was a distinctive pattern formed by natural structures within the eye. The arrangement of lines, furrows, and tiny openings inside the iris created a pattern that looked almost geometric in its precision. The iris of the human eye is unique to every individual, much like a fingerprint. No two people share exactly the same pattern. Because of this, scientists have long studied iris patterns for biometric identification. However, the structures within the iris can also reflect certain inherited traits that appear more frequently within particular genetic populations. These patterns can sometimes indicate deep ancestral origins that stretch back many generations. Researchers realized that the pattern visible in the matriarch's eyes was unusually pronounced. Even through the photographic limitations of the 19th century, the pattern was distinct enough to be analyzed using modern software. Scientists used specialized programs capable of recognizing genetic markers associated with iris structures. These systems compared the patterns seen in the photograph to databases containing thousands of documented iris configurations. When the analysis was completed, the results stunned the researchers. The pattern in the woman's eyes matched a rare genetic signature associated with a specific ancestral lineage from West Central Africa. This particular iris configuration appeared in an extremely small percentage of the global population. According to genetic studies, it was most strongly linked to descendants of royal lineages connected to the historic kingdom of Ndongo, located in what is now Angola. The discovery transformed the way researchers viewed the photograph. What had once appeared to be a simple portrait of a family living in Virginia suddenly carried profound historical significance. The matriarch seated in the center of the image might have been a descendant of one of the most powerful Royal families in African history. The kingdom of Ndongo was once ruled by a famous warrior queen who resisted European colonization for decades. Her legacy had become legendary throughout African history. If the genetic analysis was correct, the woman in the photograph carried within her the biological trace of that royal lineage. Her ancestors may have belonged to a noble family long before the transatlantic slave trade tore millions of people from their homelands. Over centuries of displacement, slavery, and forced migration, the memory of those royal origins had likely been lost or hidden. Yet the evidence had survived quietly within her DNA, preserved even in the delicate structures of her eyes. The photograph suddenly became much more than a visual record of a family living in 19th century America. It became a piece of evidence linking a modern American family to a deep and complex history, stretching across continents and centuries. What appeared at first to be a quiet moment in a portrait studio now hinted at a far larger story involving royal heritage, forced migration, and the resilience of identity across generations. The simple act of capturing a family portrait in 1888 unknowingly preserved a clue that would not be understood for more than 100 years. The family who posed for that photograph likely had no idea that future technology would examine their image so closely. They could not have imagined that scientists would one day analyze the structure of an eye recorded in the faint silver particles of an old photograph. Yet the camera had preserved every tiny detail with silent precision. For decades, the photograph remained hidden among thousands of other historical images, waiting for the moment when someone would look closely enough to notice what others had missed. Advances in science and digital imaging finally made that discovery possible. What began as routine archival work turned into a remarkable investigation that connected the quiet dignity of a family portrait with a forgotten royal lineage on another continent in March of 2019. Deep within the archival storage rooms of the Smithsonian Institution, historian Dr. Maya Richardson continued the meticulous work that had occupied her for months. The basement archives were quiet and cool, filled with long rows of shelving units stacked with boxes containing thousands of historical photographs. Each box carried fragments of forgotten leaves, faces frozen in time, moments captured decades or even centuries earlier. Maya had been assigned to the African-American Heritage Photography Project, an effort focused on cataloging and digitizing images taken during the decades after the American Civil War. The project aimed to preserve visual records of African-American families whose histories had often been ignored or erased in official documents. For 3 months, Maya's days had followed a steady rhythm. She opened box after box, carefully removing fragile photographs and placing them under controlled lighting to document their condition. Many of the images were faded from age. Some were damaged by moisture or creased from decades of improper storage. Others had lost identifying information entirely, leaving behind only anonymous faces with no names attached. Despite the repetitive nature of the work, Maya approached each photograph with respect and patience. She understood that every image represented real people whose stories had once mattered deeply to their families. Even if history had forgotten them, she believed their lives still deserved attention. On one particular morning, she opened a box labeled Virginia Studios 1880-1890. Inside were dozens of portraits taken during the late 19th century by various photographers across the state. The photograph of the family taken in Richmond in 1888 immediately stood out because of its remarkable condition. Unlike many images that had faded or deteriorated, this portrait appeared unusually well preserved. The edges were intact, the tones were still clear, and the subjects' faces were easily recognizable. Maya lifted the photograph carefully, holding it only by the edges to avoid damaging the delicate surface. The portrait showed a family of 6 posed in a formal arrangement typical of the era. The father stood behind his seated wife, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Their 4 children were positioned around them in balanced symmetry. The painted background depicted a garden scene with trees and distant pathways, a common decorative backdrop used by portrait studios in the late 19th century. Maya turned the photograph over and read the stamp on the back: J. Morrison Studio, Richmond, Virginia, September 1888. It was a simple detail, but it confirmed the photograph's origin and date. At first, the image appeared similar to hundreds of others she had cataloged. Families often saved money for months to afford professional portraits, so these photographs frequently showed people wearing their best clothing and presenting themselves with composed dignity. Yet something about this image drew Maya's attention longer than usual. She studied the faces one by one, observing their expressions and posture. There was a quiet pride in the way the family carried themselves. Their clothing was modest, but carefully chosen. Their expressions were serious but calm, reflecting the formal expectations of photography during that time. As part of her routine documentation process, Maya placed the photograph on a light table and examined it through a magnifying glass. She recorded its estimated condition, noted the number of subjects, and confirmed the studio stamp. When she leaned closer to inspect the faces more carefully, something unexpected caught her attention. The woman seated at the center of the portrait had eyes that looked unusually distinct compared to most photographs from the 1880s. Maya had spent years studying historical photography, and she understood the limitations of the technology used during that period. Cameras relied on long exposure times, often requiring subjects to remain perfectly still for several seconds. Early photographic chemicals and lenses lacked the precision of modern equipment, meaning small details were often blurred or lost. Eyes in 19th century portraits usually appeared dark and indistinct, especially in sepia tone prints where contrast was limited. Fine patterns within the iris were almost never visible. Yet the eyes of the woman in the photograph seemed unusually clear. Even through the faded tones of the image, Maya could see a faint structure inside the irises that looked sharper than expected. At first, she wondered if it was simply an illusion created by lighting or reflections. She adjusted the magnifying glass and examined the image again from different angles. The pattern remained visible. Curiosity quickly replaced her initial uncertainty. Maya had seen thousands of old portraits, and her experience told her that something about this image was genuinely unusual. The clarity in the woman's eyes seemed too precise to be a coincidence. However, a magnifying glass alone could not reveal enough detail to confirm what she thought she was seeing. She needed a higher level of analysis. Upstairs in the Smithsonian Building was the digital imaging laboratory where advanced scanning equipment was used to examine fragile historical materials. Maya knew that if the photograph were scanned at extremely high resolution, the resulting digital image could reveal microscopic details invisible to the naked eye. The lab was managed by her colleague, Dr. James Chen, a specialist in archival imaging technology. James had spent years developing techniques for scanning and analyzing delicate documents and photographs without damaging them. Maya carefully slid the photograph into a protective sleeve and walked to the elevator that connected the archive basement to the upper floors. When she arrived in the imaging laboratory, James was seated at his workstation, reviewing another digital scan. The lab was filled with specialized equipment, large flatbed scanners designed specifically for fragile historical materials, powerful computers running imaging software, and calibrated lighting systems that ensured accurate color reproduction. James immediately noticed the careful way Maya was holding the photograph. Over the years, they had worked together on many projects, and he recognized that she had likely found something interesting. She explained that she needed a high-resolution scan of the image, focusing especially on the woman's eyes. James trusted Maya's instincts and began preparing the scanning equipment. The photograph was placed gently on the scanning bed, and James adjusted the settings to capture the highest level of detail possible. Archival scanners were capable of recording images at extremely high resolutions, far beyond what ordinary scanners could achieve. This allowed researchers to zoom into tiny areas of a photograph without losing clarity. The scanning process took several minutes as the machine slowly moved across the surface of the photograph, capturing millions of pixels of information. When the scan finished, the digital image appeared on the computer monitor. At first, it looked similar to the original photograph, but now it could be enlarged without losing detail. James opened the file in specialized imaging software and began zooming toward the center of the portrait. Maya stood beside him, watching carefully as the faces of the family grew larger on the screen. When the image of the matriarch filled most of the monitor, James zoomed in further until her eyes became the focal point. The software magnified the iris until it occupied nearly the entire display. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The pattern inside the iris was far more detailed than Maya had expected. Fine radial lines extended outward from the pupil. Small openings and folds formed a complex structure that resembled an intricate natural design. What made the discovery particularly remarkable was the fact that these features had been captured by a camera in 1888. The level of clarity suggested that the photograph had been taken under ideal conditions with excellent lighting and a very steady subject. Still, it was rare for 19th century portraits to preserve such visible iris patterns. James began adjusting the contrast and sharpening filters within the imaging software to highlight the structure even more clearly. As he refined the image, the pattern became easier to see. The arrangement of lines and small openings within the iris formed a distinctive configuration that seemed unusually symmetrical. Both researchers realized that the pattern might contain information about the woman's biological ancestry. The iris of the human eye contains structures influenced by genetics, and modern biometric research had created databases capable of recognizing certain inherited traits within iris patterns. James had access to one such database used in medical research for studying genetic markers associated with eye structures. He carefully isolated the iris pattern from the photograph and entered the data into the analysis software. The system compared the pattern against thousands of known examples collected from genetic studies around the world. The process took less than a minute, but for Maya, the wait felt much longer as she watched the progress bar slowly fill on the screen. When the results appeared, both of them leaned closer to read the information. The software indicated that the iris configuration matched a rare genetic marker associated with a specific ancestral population from West Central Africa. The marker appeared in an extremely small percentage of people worldwide, making it statistically significant when identified. The discovery immediately transformed their understanding of the photograph. What had initially seemed like a minor visual curiosity now suggested a connection to a very specific historical lineage. The woman in the photograph might have carried genetic traits passed down through generations from ancestors living thousands of miles away. Maya realized that the photograph was no longer just an archival artifact documenting a family living in 19th century Virginia. It had become a piece of biological and historical evidence capable of connecting a modern American family to a distant past shaped by migration, displacement, and survival. The clarity of the iris pattern preserved in the photograph served as a bridge between centuries. A moment captured in a small portrait studio in 1888 now held the potential to reveal an entire story about ancestry and identity. The family who had posed for that photograph likely believed they were simply preserving a memory for their children and grandchildren. They could never have imagined that their image would one day be studied with advanced scientific technology capable of uncovering secrets hidden within the smallest details of their faces. The unusual iris pattern in the 1888 photograph had been identified and digitally analyzed. The discovery raised an entirely new set of questions. The software comparison suggested that the pattern visible in the matriarch's eyes was linked to a rare genetic lineage connected to West Central Africa, specifically the region that once formed the historic kingdom of Ndongo in present-day Angola. The implication was astonishing. If the analysis was correct, the woman in the portrait could have been a descendant of one of the royal families associated with that kingdom. But a digital match alone was not enough to confirm such a remarkable claim. Historical verification would require careful research through records, archives, and genealogical sources that could connect the photograph to real people and trace their family history across generations. To pursue that possibility, the historian who discovered the pattern sought help from a genealogical expert who specialized in African American ancestry. Genealogical research involving families from the era of slavery is often extraordinarily complex. Many enslaved people were denied surnames, and official records frequently ignored or misidentified them. After emancipation in 1865, formerly enslaved individuals began appearing in census documents and city directories. But even those records were often incomplete. Families were sometimes split apart, names were changed, and entire generations could disappear from documentation. Because of these challenges, genealogists must combine multiple sources: church records, marriage certificates, census listings, property documents, and local archives to reconstruct family histories. The genealogist examining the photograph immediately understood that identifying the people in the image would be the first essential step. Fortunately, the photograph contained a small but important clue. The stamp on the back of the print identified the photographer as J. Morrison of Richmond, Virginia, and included the date September 1888. Photographers in the 19th century often kept written ledgers recording their customers, both for business purposes and to track payments. If those records still existed, they might reveal the names of the family members who had posed for the portrait. Searching through preserved copies of Morrison's studio records eventually revealed an entry from the same date written in faded ink. The listing recorded that a family portrait, 6 subjects, had been photographed on September 14, 1888. Next to the description was a surname, Thomas. The ledger also included an address, 412 Clay Street in Richmond. That single entry provided the first concrete identification of the family in the photograph. With a surname and address now known, the next step involved examining city directories and census records from the late 19th century. City directories functioned somewhat like early telephone books, listing residents by name, occupation, and address. When researchers checked the Richmond directory from 1888, they found a listing for Samuel Thomas, a carpenter living at 412 Clay Street. The occupation and address matched the studio ledger perfectly, strongly suggesting that the man standing in the photograph was Samuel Thomas. Census records provided even more information. In the 1880 United States Census, a Samuel Thomas appeared in Richmond, listed as a black carpenter born in Virginia. Living with him was his wife Grace Thomas and several young children. Their ages corresponded closely to the children visible in the 1888 photograph. By the time the portrait was taken 8 years later, those children would have grown into the boys and girls standing beside their parents in the studio. For historians, identifying the family was a significant breakthrough. What had been an anonymous photograph was now connected to real individuals with names and a place in documented history. Samuel Thomas appeared to have been a skilled tradesman working as a carpenter during the years following the Civil War. For a black man in the 1880s South, that occupation suggested a certain degree of stability and community respect. Skilled laborers often played important roles in rebuilding cities and neighborhoods during Reconstruction. The census entry for Grace Thomas, however, contained a detail that drew particular attention. In addition to listing her age and birthplace, a note beside her name described her occupation as a midwife and healer. In many black communities during the 19th century, midwives held vital positions. They assisted in childbirth, treated illnesses with herbal remedies, and passed down traditional medical knowledge that had often been preserved through generations. Their expertise was deeply respected, especially in communities where access to formal medical care was limited. Further investigation into church records added another important piece to the puzzle. Churches were among the most reliable record keepers within black communities after the Civil War. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals were frequently documented with careful detail, and those records sometimes survived when other official documents did not. When researchers examined records from Ebenezer Baptist Church in Richmond, they discovered entries for the Thomas family. The 4 children from the photograph, Robert, Elizabeth, Thomas Jr., and Mary, were listed in baptism records during the late 1870s and early 1880s. More importantly, the church ledger recorded the marriage of Samuel Thomas to a woman named Grace Oladell in October 1874. This discovery revealed that Grace's maiden name had been Oladell, a name that did not appear commonly in Virginia during that period. The unusual surname raised new questions about her ancestry. Linguistic historians and genealogists recognized that the name resembled forms found in West African languages, suggesting a possible connection to African heritage that had survived despite the pressures of slavery. Church documents also contained notes describing Grace's reputation within the community. One entry written by a minister mentioned that she possessed unusual knowledge of healing herbs, and that she had learned these skills from her mother. The note also stated that Grace rarely spoke about her origins or family background. Such silence was not unusual among people who had experienced or inherited the trauma of slavery. Many individuals avoided discussing painful memories connected to separation, loss, or forced migration. At this point, the historical evidence began aligning with the genetic discovery from the iris analysis. The rare iris pattern suggested ancestry connected to the Ndongo royal lineage of Angola, while Grace's unusual surname and background hinted at African roots that had not fully disappeared from memory. Yet historians still needed to understand how someone with such ancestry could have ended up living in Virginia in the late 19th century. To answer that question, researchers examined records of the transatlantic slave trade. Although the United States officially banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, illegal trafficking and earlier slave shipments had brought millions of people from Africa to North America during the previous centuries. Detailed manifests were sometimes kept by ships transporting enslaved individuals, listing the number of people on board and occasionally including notes about unusual circumstances. One particular document drew attention: the manifest of a Portuguese slave ship named the Esperança that arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1847. The record described more than 200 enslaved individuals transported from the port of Luanda in Angola. Among the notes written in the margin of the document was a curious entry describing a woman and a small child who had been separated from the main group upon arrival and sold privately rather than through a public auction. The note stated that the woman claimed to be of royal blood. Private sales sometimes occurred when buyers believed certain individuals possessed special skills, knowledge, or status that made them more valuable than others. The reference to royal ancestry may have seemed unbelievable to slave traders at the time, but it was significant enough for someone to record it in writing. If the woman mentioned in that manifest was connected to Grace Oladell, it could explain how traces of a royal lineage had survived within a family living in Virginia decades later. Researchers continued tracing plantation records, letters, and estate documents belonging to families who had purchased enslaved individuals during that period. Eventually, a letter written by the wife of a plantation owner provided another crucial clue. The letter described an African woman named Nzinga who had died in childbirth in 1858 while living on a Virginia plantation. The newborn child survived. The date of that birth corresponded closely with the estimated birth year for Grace Thomas listed in the census records. If the infant described in the letter was indeed Grace, it would mean that her mother had arrived in America years earlier on the Esperança, carrying with her the heritage of a royal African lineage. That heritage would then have passed to her daughter, preserved through generations despite slavery, displacement, and silence. The connection between the genetic iris pattern, the historical records of Grace Oladell, and the documented arrival of an Angolan woman claiming royal ancestry created a powerful narrative supported by both science and archival evidence. The photograph taken in 1888 had captured more than a family portrait. It had unknowingly preserved the face of a woman whose ancestry stretched back to one of Africa's most legendary royal houses, a lineage that had endured unimaginable upheaval yet still remained visible in the smallest details of her eyes. Historians and genealogists had identified the family in the 1888 photograph as Samuel and Grace Thomas and their 4 children. The investigation entered its most emotional and significant stage. The evidence from the iris analysis and historical records suggested that Grace Thomas might have been the descendant of a royal lineage from the Kingdom of Dongo in Angola. Yet proving that connection required more than documents and speculation. To confirm the story scientifically, researchers needed to locate living descendants of the Thomas family and compare their DNA with the genetic markers identified in the photograph. Tracing descendants from the late 19th century into the modern day is a complex process. Families grow and spread across cities, states, and sometimes across the country over several generations. Names change through marriage, records disappear, and entire branches of family trees can become difficult to follow. Fortunately, the census records from 1900 provided a starting point. By examining those documents, researchers could see what happened to the children who appeared in the photograph as they grew older. The census indicated that Samuel Thomas had died sometime in the mid-1890s, leaving Grace to raise the family. Grace herself lived until 1912. During those years, the 4 children had grown up, married, and started families of their own. Each of them created new branches in the Thomas family tree. By carefully following marriage records, birth certificates, and later census listings, genealogists were able to track where those descendants eventually settled. One branch of the family eventually led to Philadelphia. In the records, Researchers identified a woman named Dorothy Williams, who appeared to be the great-great-granddaughter of Robert Thomas, the oldest son shown in the photograph. Robert had grown up in Richmond, later moved north, and his descendants eventually settled in Pennsylvania. By the early 21st century, Dorothy was 76 years old and still living in Philadelphia with her family. For the historians working on the case, contacting Dorothy was both exciting and delicate. They understood that family history can be deeply personal, especially when it involves the painful legacy of slavery. The call had to be respectful and careful. When the historian finally dialed Dorothy's phone number one evening, she introduced herself and explained that she was researching a photograph taken in Richmond in 1888. She told Dorothy that the image appeared to show her great-great-grandparents. At first there was silence on the line. Then Dorothy asked a question filled with emotion. She wanted to know if the researcher truly had a picture of her ancestors. For many African American families, photographs from the 19th century simply do not exist. Poverty, forced relocation, and historical discrimination often meant that family heirlooms were lost over time. Dorothy explained that her grandmother had once told stories about a portrait taken long ago. But the image had disappeared during the Great Depression when the family had been forced to move. For decades, relatives had wondered what their ancestors actually looked like. The historian explained that she would like to visit Dorothy in person to show her the photograph. But there was something else she needed to discuss as well. She carefully described the unusual discovery involving Grace Thomas's eyes and the possibility that Grace might have carried genetic markers linked to an African royal lineage. To confirm that possibility, scientists would need to compare modern DNA samples with the genetic markers associated with the iris pattern identified in the photograph. Dorothy listened quietly while the explanation unfolded. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steady but emotional. She shared something that surprised the researcher. According to family stories passed down through generations, Grace Thomas had often told her children that they came from kings and queens. At the time, many people assumed the words were simply a way of inspiring pride in a world that constantly tried to diminish their worth. But Dorothy said the story had always been repeated within the family. She remembered hearing her grandmother say that Grace possessed remarkable healing abilities and that people believed she could sense illness just by looking at someone. Family members also spoke about her eyes, describing them as unusual and powerful. Hearing those old stories again suddenly made the scientific discovery feel even more meaningful. Dorothy agreed to participate in the research and consented to provide a DNA sample. Several weeks later, the historian and her colleagues traveled to Philadelphia to meet her and her family. The meeting took place in Dorothy's living room, where 3 generations had gathered to hear what the researchers had discovered. Dorothy sat beside her daughter Karen, while her grandson Marcus stood nearby listening closely. The atmosphere in the room carried a mixture of curiosity, anticipation, and nervous excitement. Before discussing the DNA results, the historian first showed them the photograph from 1888. For Dorothy, seeing the faces of her ancestors for the first time was overwhelming. She leaned forward and studied the image carefully, tracing her finger gently across the photograph. She looked at Samuel standing proudly behind his wife, and then at Grace seated calmly at the center. The 4 children surrounding them were the same ancestors whose names had been spoken in family stories for generations. Dorothy immediately noticed something familiar in Grace's face. The shape of her jaw, the calm strength in her expression, and especially her eyes reminded Dorothy of her own mother and grandmother. Karen, her daughter, saw the resemblance as well. The connection across generations was unmistakable. After giving the family time to absorb the photograph, the scientists began explaining the genetic findings. DNA testing had been conducted using Dorothy's sample and compared with genetic markers previously identified through the iris analysis and additional genetic databases containing samples from populations in Angola. The results showed that Dorothy carried the same rare genetic markers that had been detected in the photograph of Grace Thomas. These markers were extremely uncommon globally, but were strongly associated with descendants of the Ndongo royal lineage. Genetic mapping suggested that Grace Thomas had been a direct descendant of Queen Nzinga, the legendary ruler who had governed the kingdom of Ndongo and Matamba during the 17th century. Queen Nzinga was famous for resisting Portuguese colonization and defending her kingdom's independence for decades. Her leadership had made her one of the most respected figures in African history. According to the genetic analysis, Grace was likely about 7 generations removed from that royal ancestor. The lineage had survived through centuries of upheaval, including the transatlantic slave trade and life under slavery in America. Despite everything that had happened, the biological evidence of that ancestry remained present in the DNA of her descendants. When Dorothy heard the confirmation, she covered her mouth in disbelief. Tears filled her eyes as she tried to process the information. For decades, her family had repeated stories about royal ancestry without any proof. Now science had confirmed that those stories might actually have been rooted in truth. Karen reached over and held her mother's hand while Marcus leaned closer to see the charts displayed on the scientist's laptop. As a history student, Marcus was fascinated by the idea that his own family's story was connected to such a powerful historical figure. He asked how it was possible for the descendant of a queen to end up enslaved in America. The genealogist explained the tragic path uncovered through historical records. The evidence suggested that Grace's mother had been an African woman brought to America on a slave ship in the mid-19th century. That woman had claimed royal ancestry when she arrived, though no one at the time believed her. She was eventually sold to a plantation in Virginia, where she later died while giving birth to Grace. Grace grew up never knowing her mother or the truth about her heritage, yet the knowledge passed down through her older half-sister and the traditions she preserved within her healing practices kept fragments of that heritage alive. Even though the full story had been lost, Grace seemed to carry a quiet understanding of her own worth and identity. The photograph taken in 1888 had unknowingly preserved the final piece of evidence needed to reconnect that broken history. By capturing the image of Grace's eyes with such clarity, the camera had recorded a biological signature that would only be recognized more than a century later. For Dorothy and her family, the discovery transformed the meaning of their own identity. The story was no longer just about surviving slavery and hardship. It was also about a heritage that stretched back to African kingdoms and powerful leaders who had shaped history long before their descendants were brought to America. The realization created a powerful emotional moment inside the living room. Generations of silence, uncertainty, and fragmented family stories suddenly came together into a single narrative supported by both history and science. The photograph that had once sat forgotten in an archive had become the key that restored a lost chapter of their family's past and reconnected them with a legacy that had been hidden for more than a century. Several months after the discovery that connected the 1888 photograph to a royal African lineage, the story reached a moment that felt almost symbolic. The photograph that had once sat unnoticed inside an archival box was now being recognized for its historical importance. Historians, genealogists, and museum curators agreed that the image represented far more than a simple family portrait. It documented a powerful story about ancestry, survival, and the preservation of identity across generations, despite the forces of slavery and displacement. Because of that significance, the photograph was officially added to the permanent collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian Institution. The decision to include the photograph in the museum's collection carried deep meaning. Museums often display objects that represent turning points in history or that help explain the experiences of people whose voices were once ignored. For generations, African American history had often been told through the lens of struggle and oppression alone. While those experiences were undeniably important parts of the story, historians increasingly recognize the importance of also highlighting resilience, heritage, and cultural continuity. The 1888 photograph captured all of those elements in a single image. What made the photograph particularly powerful was the way it connected multiple layers of history at once. On the surface, it showed a black family in the late 19th century presenting themselves with dignity and pride during a time when racism and discrimination were widespread. Beneath that surface, the image carried hidden evidence of a royal lineage from Africa that had survived the transatlantic slave trade. The photograph also represented the modern era of historical research, where technology and genetics could work together with archival documents to uncover stories that had been buried for generations. To commemorate the discovery, the museum organized a special gathering for the descendants of Samuel and Grace Thomas. Genealogists had spent weeks tracing branches of the family tree, contacting relatives across the United States, and explaining the significance of the photograph. Many of those relatives had never met one another before. Some lived in cities thousands of miles apart and had grown up without knowing much about their extended family history. Yet all of them shared a connection to the same ancestors who had stood together in that Richmond portrait studio in 1888. On a warm afternoon in September, exactly 131 years after the original photograph had been taken, more than 40 members of the Thomas family gathered inside the museum. The timing was intentional. Curators wanted the moment to mirror the date when Samuel and Grace Thomas had once stood with their children to create a record of their family. What began as a small portrait meant for personal memory had now grown into a moment of historical recognition shared by generations of descendants. The museum arranged a large digital display showing the photograph. After it had been carefully restored, modern imaging techniques had enhanced the faded tones, repaired minor damage, and brought out the details that had been hidden in the original print. The faces of Samuel, Grace, and their children appeared clearer than they had been in decades. Visitors standing in front of the display could see every feature in remarkable detail, including the distinctive eyes that had started the entire investigation. For many members of the family, seeing the photograph for the first time was deeply emotional. Some had heard stories about ancestors who lived in Virginia long ago, but they had never seen their faces. Others knew very little about their family's past before the early 20th century. Historical records for African American families from the 19th century are often incomplete, leaving many people with only fragments of information about earlier generations. The photograph changed that completely. Suddenly, the family had a visual connection to their ancestors, a moment preserved in time that confirmed their presence in history. Dorothy Williams, the woman whose DNA had helped confirm the royal lineage, stood at the center of the gathering. At 76 years old, she had become the living bridge between the past and present generations of the family. She looked around the room and saw relatives she had never met before. Some had traveled from as far away as Georgia, Texas, and California after learning about the discovery. Others lived closer by, but had not previously known how their branches of the family connected. As people gathered in small groups, conversations filled the room. Relatives compared family stories, shared photographs, and talked about memories passed down by grandparents and great-grandparents. Many were amazed to discover how certain traits seemed to repeat across generations. Some noticed similarities in facial features, while others commented on shared personality traits or talents that seemed to run through the family. One older man named Joseph had traveled from Atlanta to attend the event. He stood quietly in front of the photograph, studying the face of Samuel Thomas, the carpenter who had been the father in the portrait. Joseph explained that he owned a set of carpentry tools that had been passed down through his family for generations. According to family tradition, the tools had originally belonged to an ancestor who worked as a builder in Richmond long ago. Until that day, Joseph had never known what that ancestor actually looked like. Seeing Samuel's face in the photograph created a powerful sense of connection between the stories he had heard growing up and the reality of the man who had lived more than a century earlier. Nearby, a young woman named Aaliyah stood looking at the image of Grace Thomas. Aaliyah was Dorothy's great-niece and part of the youngest generation present at the gathering. When scientists had conducted additional DNA tests on other family members, Aaliyah had also been found to carry the rare genetic markers associated with the Ndongo royal lineage. She even possessed the same distinctive iris pattern that had first drawn attention to the photograph. When she looked at Grace's eyes in the restored image, she could see the resemblance immediately. Aaliyah spoke about how she had always felt a sense of pride in her family history, even though many details were missing. Her grandmother often told her that their ancestors came from greatness, though she never knew exactly what that meant. Now, standing inside the museum and looking at the photograph, Aaliyah felt that the missing pieces of the story had finally been restored. The gathering was not simply about celebrating a historical discovery. It was also about honoring the lives of the people in the photograph who had never imagined that their story would one day be rediscovered. In 1888, Samuel and Grace Thomas had saved money to sit for a portrait in a professional studio. At the time, the decision likely felt important but ordinary. They probably wanted their children to remember their faces and preserve a record of their family. They could not have known that the photograph would eventually help restore an entire lineage that had been nearly erased by history. When the time came for a formal moment during the gathering, Dorothy stood in front of her extended family and shared a few words. She spoke about Grace Thomas, the ancestor who had carried the legacy of her mother, without fully knowing the truth about her origins. Grace had lived through a period when opportunities for Black women were limited, yet she had become a respected healer and midwife within her community. She had raised her children and taught them to value their worth despite the hardships they faced. Dorothy reminded the family that Grace had often told her children that they came from kings and queens. For many years, those words sounded like a simple message meant to inspire pride. Now, however, the family understood that the statement might have been more than encouragement. It may have been a fragment of truth passed down through memory, even after the details had been lost. After Dorothy finished speaking, Marcus, her grandson, took out his phone and gathered the family together for a photograph. The moment echoed the scene from 1888 in an unexpected way. Just as Samuel and Grace had once stood with their children to capture a moment for the future, their descendants now stood together to record their own place in the continuing story of the family. The new photograph showed dozens of relatives standing side by side inside the museum, smiling as they looked at the camera. Behind them on the screen was the restored image of their ancestors from more than a century earlier. Two photographs separated by 131 years had become part of the same story, connecting generations through a shared history that had finally been rediscovered.